Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by John Clark. Welcome.
Hi, Colleen. Thanks for having
Thanks
me.
for being on today. And today we're going to be discussing your new book, Betrayed Without a Kiss. Let me get the subtitle correct. Defending Marriage After Years of Failed Leadership in the Church. And that's a really big topic. What motivated you to write about this in the first place?
Yeah, so originally, a friend came to me probably, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago. He was having some difficulties with his marriage and looked like a divorce might be on the horizon. And he came to me for some advice. And that's when I really started looking into what's the status of marriage these days, right? What's going on in the church? And until that point, um, as a Catholic, I went to Christendom College, studied, sacramental theology with Dr. William Marshner, thought I knew things pretty well. But one of the things that disturbed me was when I started looking around and looking at the annulment numbers. They're very troubling, and I'll probably get into more specifics of that a little bit later. But just to broadly answer your question for now, it looked as though there was a problem with annulments and what was going on at the church with annulments, and then the number of marriages was down quite considerably. And so, but to answer your question, that's what started the process of me that ended up in a book. I didn't set out, when he said, John, can you help me? I didn't say, yeah, and I'll write a book. It was just that sort of happened. So the book is basically a result of what I discovered in researching, trying to help my friend.
Interesting. And so before we dive into the whole content of the book, can you just clarify what an annulment is versus what a divorce is for people listening? I think a lot of people listening to the podcast probably have a general idea, but I think it's good to kind of clarify that at the outset so people can understand this conversation.
That's a good point. So annulment, which we should probably call a finding of nullity,
Okay.
is a discovery process whereby a marriage that was once considered valid is deemed to have never been. Okay.
Mhm.
So nullity is about the wedding day. Like they'll try to go back and look at the wedding day. That's finding what was considered to be a marriage not to have ever taken place. There was never a marriage. That's what a finding of nullity means. It doesn't mean that there was a marriage, but now there's not.
Mhm.
It means there was never a marriage. A divorce, so that's an ecclesiastical process. A divorce, by contrast, is a civil. It's a civil case,
Mhm.
right? So a divorce is simply the state coming in and saying, no, this marriage is dissolved. That's the difference. So an annulment is that a marriage never was. A divorce is a civil thing saying that there was a marriage, but there isn't one now because it's being dissolved by one or both parties.
So an annulment is not just Catholic divorce. It's a statement that the marriage never occurred in the first place.
Yes, but I would put an asterisk to that, and that kind of gets to the heart of one of these problems, is that an annulment is not Catholic divorce. Yes, end of sentence in a paragraph. Okay. The problem now is, and one of the discoveries, one of the things I found out to try to figure out what's really going on, what's happening to marriage, is that every diocese in America that I'm aware of requires civil divorce paperwork before a marriage tribunal can even convene.
Whoa. Why? What's the
Right.
reason?
And so, okay, now that's a great question. That's what I was wondering. So there are basically two answers. The first one is that the dioceses are worried about what's called alien. It falls under the case of alienation of affection. Alienation of affection is sort of held over from common law, and essentially it goes like this. So let's say that my wife and I were having troubles in our marriage, and uh, someone convinced her to divorce me. Every time he saw her, he kept, insisting, you should just leave, John. Okay. She goes to get the divorce. Theoretically, I could sue him for alienation of affection to say, she wouldn't have left me if you hadn't been constantly saying she should leave me, right?
Mhm.
So theoretically, the church is worried about, these are actually called, it's called home wrecker laws,
Mhm.
someone who sort of instigated the divorce. So in the first instance, the church is worried about that. that, well, if we find an annulment, if this diocese finds an annulment, we could theoretically be liable for a suit of alienation of affection. Okay, so that's the logic behind it. But I discovered something very interesting. There are 50 states in America. That's no newsflash. 44 states don't have any alienation of affection laws in the books. That is, you can't file a case because it's not a law in those states. So only in 6 states do alienation of affection laws exist. Only 6. And in those 6, corporations like churches are never sued. So the whole idea that dioceses are worried about alienation of affection suits, they're worried about a phantom. It doesn't exist. And so that's the first. That's the first. That's the first explanation they give.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay. In other words, does it make sense insofar as it doesn't make
Yeah.
sense? Okay. The second instance that dioceses give is that they'll say, well, a civil divorce, if somebody walks in with a civil divorce paperwork, they have had their divorce decree, that serves as proof that this couple just can't get along. They've tried to reconcile, it didn't work. Okay. Here's the problem. So in America, we have unilateral no fault divorce.
Mhm.
If my wife wants to leave me, I should stop using ours as an example because I'm in a storybook marriage. I always say I've had a crush on my wife since Reagan was in office, but my wife wants to leave her husband.
Mhm.
She doesn't need to do anything other than just file a unilateral divorce and say she wants out. She doesn't need to talk to her husband. She can just leave. So in that scenario, are we looking at a real life example of two people who sat down but couldn't work things out? No. In many cases, we're not looking at that at all.
Mhm.
And so to me, it's rather shocking that the dioceses will say, well, they tried. 70% of divorces in America are truly unilateral in the sense that 70% of the time, the other spouse did not want a divorce. So both of the examples that the dioceses give are really bad. And so again, then they sit down in front of the marriage tribunal, and there's an extraordinarily high probability that they will have a finding of nullity, and that's kind of where it all starts.
Interesting. What's the problem with them requiring a divorce, a civil divorce, before looking at the marriage? Is there a problem with that, or is it just that they're being extra cautious about something that they don't need to worry about?
Well, again, they're worried. One of the things they're worried about doesn't exist, as I mentioned,
Mhm.
and the second one is that they're thinking it's been attempted to reconcile.
Mhm.
So, what is humanity? Let's back out the fact that we're talking about the Catholic Church, which is the guardian of the sacrament of reconciliation.
Mhm.
So, let's just say that this is sort of a non-church body
Okay.
looking at a husband and wife, just looking at it from the perspective of humanity. Wouldn't you try to reconcile the couple? That would seem to be a natural place to start. But the time, but by contrast with a system that exists, by the time they sit down for the hearing for the marriage tribunal, they have a divorce in hand.
Mhm.
And so remember, the key thing about the difference between, you start off with a really excellent question. What's the difference between annulment and divorce? While annulment isn't divorce, the annulment process requires divorce. And the large problem is, in large measure, God hates divorce. It's in the book of Malachi. I mean, God hates divorce. I don't think this is any news flash to people listening. God hates divorce, right?
Mhm.
I probably can't say that too many times because the problem is, so when the dioceses are saying, no, go and do something that God hates, and then we'll hear your case.
Mhm.
And so let's say for the sake of argument that a couple goes in and wants to get, let's say they both, want to get their annulment and they think, no, this was never valid.
Mhm.
Well, the problem is that what happens in the case of that couple who got the civil divorce paperwork? I mean, a contentious divorce in America is going to run upwards of $100,000. It's not cheap. So they've drained their 401ks or drained their savings accounts. They're at the table to hear the tribunal. And let's say the judges come back and they say, no, your marriage is actually valid. We're not going to grant you the decree of nullity. Now what do you do? Well, you used to have a lot of money. Let's say $100,000 for the sake of argument is a lot of money. And what do? You could have used that for your kids' college. You could have used that for food, rent, things like that. Instead, the money was used for divorce lawyers. Then what do you do? Do you get remarried by the state? I guess you would have to. But again, there are laws precluding you from doing that in some cases. So the whole thing is disastrous. And so, effect what's happening is that the church is waiting in terms of the adjudication of a sacrament.
Mhm.
The dioceses are waiting for the civil for a civil action to occur. That to me is about as backwards as it gets. They should be saying, okay, first of all, when they come in, they were having problems in their marriage. Try to reconcile them. That's in many cases it's not happening. It does happen some of the time, in fairness, but in a lot of cases it's not. But like we're not going to have this until we get the divorce paperwork in hand. It's as backward as it gets.
So, from my understanding, a church assumes that a marriage is valid until proven otherwise, basically. What are
hmm
the grounds for annulment or a declaration of nullity in the church?
So if you go to canon law, again, a really good question. If you go to canon law, there are a number of things that could result in a finding of nullity. But that would be a really long discussion. But it's important to highlight that typically now the jurisprudence is centered around the psychological incapacity to consent. So it would be, well, they weren't psychologically ready to commit
Mhm.
themselves. Um, that's essentially it. And so right now, what you have is in some churches they even have this in the back of in the back of the church. There'll be a brochure about could you get an annulment,
Mhm.
which has seemed to me to be about as imprudent as things get. Because, well, I'll answer your question and come back to that. But so essentially, the idea is that they weren't psychologically prepared.
Okay.
Um, that's almost impossible. I mean, from a legal perspective, what does that mean?
Mhm.
I would say that in the church, if the idea is that, well, there was just so much immaturity from that person. Well, the church allows marriage at the ages of 14 and 16, right, by canon law. So essentially, what you're saying is no, she didn't have the average maturity of a 14-year-old.
Mhm.
In other words, the church is not demanding some. We don't have to have PhDs in theology. I guess it'd be nice if we did, but we don't need to have PhDs in theology to understand, okay, fidelity, permanence, openness to children. These are basic. And I would challenge the priests who were marrying them in the first place. If they really weren't, why was the priest marrying them? I mean, if we have any sort of marriage prep, and we still do, I mean, I don't know of a diocese that doesn't require something in the way of marriage prep.
Mhm.
Essentially, that's the problem. And so when you leave this open to, especially in a world where there's so much psychobabble going on, right? Was this person mental? Were they prepared? Where were they? And by the way, in some cases, 35 years ago was Bill ready? 30, really? Because for 35 years, Bill and his wife thought this was a valid marriage.
Mhm.
So 35 years later, but to me, one of the problem is that many dioceses are in effect pushing annulments because there were brochures, and I would justify that statement by saying that there are brochures for annulments in the back of churches.
Mhm.
Imagine for a moment that happening with any other sacrament. Imagine walking into your local parish and you see a brochure that says, "Was your baptism valid?" Uh, that's a really good way to make people like hyper scrupulous, right? Like, I don't know. I was there. Do I remember it really well? No. I don't know the name of the priest that baptized me, right? Was your confirmation valid? Was your first confession valid? Right. And so this is why you mentioned that marriages are presumed valid unless and until proven otherwise. Well, that's true for all the sacraments, right? So we're proceeding as though the marriage never was in a lot of these cases. And I will add that divorce is an industry in America. Like oil is an industry, like software is an industry, like food is an industry, divorce is an industry. And all the money is on the side of divorce. There's no money on my job in writing this book was to try to write a love letter to the sacrament of matrimony.
Mhm.
There's no money on my side, right? It's all on the other side. It's all on the side of divorce. Divorce Inc. That's what we have in America.
Okay, so the big question that kind of came up to me while I was reading through your book was,
Hmm.
from my understanding, if a couple does not understand what marriage entails, like they don't know that they have to be open
Hmm.
to children, or they don't know that marriage is for life in the church, that is a reason for getting an annulment. Is that correct?
If they didn't know, no, I would say it like this: if they're not so there'd be a difference in. So if you think it go back to somebody's wedding day, right? Let's try to think about this. So um, you would have to be open to life.
Mhm.
That is true. There would have to be openness to life. Um,
But
does it have to be front and center?
like for instance, a couple who has a prenup is they
Hmm.
have like an intention going into the marriage that they're expecting it not to last, or that there's a possibility that it won't last. So they're entering the marriage without a full understand, like without fully intending when they say those vows to necessarily mean them. That's more of the situation.
I would not.
That's like what I was
Okay, so prenup. Okay, so in the case of a prenup, I would say this: a prenup does not invalidate a marriage per se. I mean, I should say a prenup per se does not invalidate a marriage. It wouldn't invalidate this. It wouldn't invalidate the sacrament. It wouldn't do that. Now, if the prenup said this is an open marriage, sure, that would I mean, if you're not, if you have no intention of fidelity, if you're getting married on a Friday morning and you have a date with someone else Saturday night, yeah, sure, that would be a pretty big
but if
signal. But if what's interesting,
no, go ahead. I'll in a moment.
no, I was going to say, I was going to say, what's interesting, Colleen, is that is not typically what's used as grounds.
Okay.
It's rare that someone uses that as grounds. So, for instance, one of the grounds would be the failure to disclose something of a serious nature that would otherwise it would be something that let's say the woman wouldn't marry the man because of.
Mhm.
Okay, so if you're like a fugitive and you're wanted in like 3 states for some heinous crimes, but you never told her, yeah, that would be grounds for finding of nullity.
Mhm.
Um, but these are things that aren't really. You're asking a really good question, but these aren't things that are typically used as grounds. It's very rare.
Okay.
It's a psychological thing that is used overwhelmingly.
Mhm.
In fact, Cardinal Burke, who was the former head of the Apostolic Signatura, which is basically the Supreme Court of the Roman Catholic Church,
Mhm.
he's saying the psychological grounds are so often used and so stringently. He says, in effect, he said, everybody's going to start wondering if anybody has a psychological, ability to get married. Am I up to par in terms of where I should be psychologically? So it's a pretty big concern. And that is why this issue, as I mentioned earlier, I have a storybook marriage for 31 years. So what is nullity? What does it mean in my life? It means that my marriage might be starting to look at, like I've seen John Clark in interviews, I don't know, psychologically, you know what I mean? So all of our marriages can be held in suspicion, right? And that's a pretty significant problem.
That
So,
that's a fair concern. I guess my question was more that I wonder if the number of annulments is necessarily because the church is granting them when they shouldn't be, or if it's more of a
mhm,
problem of people going into marriage without adequate marriage prep, where they're going in intending never to have children, like no openness to life at all. They're just looking for a life partner, or people going in having a prenup that's like has an instance of divorce in it, for example. Like, oh, if we get divorced, this is who takes what money. This is the wife takes this much, the husband takes that much. Or other
mhm,
instances where people are going into it not ever having been properly catechized on what they're actually vowing to when they exchange the vows.
mhm.
Do you know anything about that?
Well,
Or like, what are your thoughts?
well, I would look at it this. So I would look at it this way. I would say that I would look at numbers. I'll look at two numbers that I think are pretty illustrative on this. The first one is that in the late 1960s, there were 336 annulments in America.
Mhm.
That is every diocese combined, 336 annulments in America in its totality. 20 years later, there were 72,000 annulments in a year. So we went from call it 350 to 70,000. That's a 20,000% increase in one generation.
Mhm.
So there's that. I would use that as one data point. And we'd have to start saying, well, has human nature changed? Well, no, it hasn't. So, these numbers don't work. These numbers simply are completely unjustifiable. And I would say that the marriage tribunals have gone rogue. And the backing I would say for that statement would be this. So if a marriage tribunal decides that your marriage was null, there's a right of appeal.
Mhm.
It's right out there, and many times they are appealed. So Father Murray, who was he's on he's on the EWTN with Raymond Arroyo's show, the Papal Posse. He was interviewed about this, and it was a book I reviewed a couple of years ago. But he was on a tribunal in New York, and I believe his figure was that between 90 to 95% of American uh, annulments are overturned at the Roman Rota.
Wow.
So just so we understand what that all means. It means that if it's 95%, it would mean that 19 out of 20 annulment findings of nullity were overturned at the Roman Rota. So if you have a lower court that is overturned 95% of the time, that doesn't speak well for the lower court, right? So if the Supreme Court is over in America, so if the Supreme Court, and let's just imagine, let's imagine we have pretty conservative judges, okay? If the Supreme Court is overturning 95% of cases that come out of the California courts, that's not a good sign. And I would say that that's pretty troubling. So to your point, are they overturning too many? Well, it doesn't matter what I think. It matters what the Roman Rota thinks. The Roman Rota thinks it is yes. And in the book, I have detailed Pope St. John Paul II year after year after year saying, what is going on? Why are there so many annulments? They shouldn't be going on. And he specifically mentions the problem of using psychology as a reason for an annulment finding, because while that I'm sure does exist in some of the cases, I'm sure of that. But to be constantly looking and thinking, okay, well, what boxes can we check? That's the problem. And so the popes have been, Cardinal Burke. I mean, if you go back and look at the former, the heads of the Apostolic Signatura, they've been in pretty strong agreement on this. America is overturning, it's not just America, but America highlights because, people come here for annulment shopping.
Mhm.
As I say in the book, I mean, if our dollar is weak, people come to America to shop. If the church in America is weak, people come to America for annulments. That's what's really going on. So while there should be some findings of nullity, that's for sure, the numbers are staggering. So that's I think that the answer to your question, that's a long answer, but I think the answer to your question is found in the numbers.
Okay. Yeah, that was just the big thing that jumped out at me is, okay, is this a problem with the actual granting of annulments, or is it a problem with people not being adequately prepared by the church to go into marriage in the first place, to like know what they're getting into? The thesis of your book, you said, was that the church and marriage rise and fall together. Can you describe that a little bit? Because I thought that was a really interesting just statement and observation about the history of marriage and the history of the church.
Sure. So I would look at it at this. I would say that the seven sacraments are meant to be symbiotic, meaning that they rise and fall together. So what you have right now, and it seems like every day there's a new report that comes out and talks about how the number of Catholics who believe in the real presence has actually dropped again.
Mhm.
And I don't know what numbers I've seen different numbers, but the numbers are alarming. I haven't seen one study that I thought, it's nearly 100%. That's great. No, it's very low, the percentage of Catholics that believe in the real presence. But to me, where much of that began is the disbelief in the sacrament of matrimony. Because either words matter or they don't.
Mhm.
This is my body. That's either what's really going on, right, or it's not. Is this is my body? What does that mean? Do I believe that? I do. What's going on? Does that matter? So my thinking is words matter. Your sins are forgiven. All right. The sacraments rise and fall together. And essentially, Jesus, for lack of a better term, drew it up this way, right? So on a very positive note, I would say this. So a few days ago, my wife and I went to mass, and we stopped for a cup of coffee, and then we went to confession. Our marriage was stronger for that. Our marriage was strengthened for going to mass, receiving communion together, kneeling down and praying, the prayers of thanksgiving, going to confession, having our sins absolved. Our marriage is stronger for it. So marriage is nourished by the sacrament. So when we say we live a sacramental life, it nourishes the matrimony. It nourishes the marriage. And so that's what I'm getting at there. But we have to start looking at it as all the sacraments matter, words matter, and we need to realize that if you're going to have that many annulments, you will therefore have a lack of people believing in the real presence.
Can you expand on that a little bit? Is that just because you're saying they rise and fall together, or is there some direct connection in there that, like, is it only coming down to the words matter, or is there something else that you're seeing there?
Well, again, so it's a question of whether you're taking the sacrament seriously or not.
Okay.
When you are, yeah. So when you are, I guess I'd say it like this. So if you stand ready to say, no, that sacrament wasn't valid, it never was, that's bad. Where does that leave you? I mean, the ideal number of findings of nullity in some sense would be zero, right? Now, and I say that as somebody who says, yes, of course, there are some marriages that never were.
Mhm.
That's true. There was fraud involved. There was this or that. There was maybe an issue of form. There was something involved. That marriage never was. But even that's sad,
Mhm.
right? But in the case where you're moving it up to 70,000, and again, let me throw another number in there because I think this drives the point home as well. So if we go back to the late 1960s, we had over 400,000 weddings a year. 400,000 weddings a year. I think then in 1968 there were 426,000 weddings. So you go to I'm sorry, 2020. You have essentially a few generations later. There were fewer than 100,000 weddings in the year 2020. So we look at the annulment numbers again, about 350 to 70,000. We look at weddings, 400,000 to 100,000. These lines are going to cross. I mean, if you simply look at, I worked at Wall Street. I love to look at charts and graphs. But the fact of the matter is that this is a chart and graph that's not good. I mean, this is, my goodness, what happens in a year when we have more annulments and marriages? That's where we are. And so when you're introducing into people's minds that sacraments can be basically found null in a widespread way, that I do believe has an effect on how people are viewing the rest of the sacraments.
Interesting. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of flesh that out a little bit because it's a big statement saying that as you have more annulments, you have fewer people believing in the Eucharist. And that's a really interesting
Mhm.
connection, especially because right now we're still in the year of the Eucharist, though I don't think for not much longer. And or the Eucharistic, not the year of
Mhm.
the Eucharist, the Eucharistic revival in the United States. And I think it's a
Right.
really interesting observation to kind of come in the middle of that, that maybe we need this Eucharistic revival because we have a crisis created by our lack of respect, I guess, for marriage or lack of, yeah,
Yes,
there's a word there that I can't think of.
I think you did beautifully. That's exactly right.
Yeah, you talked in your book about how the Protestant Reformation was kind of based on a collapse of marriage or their idea of marriage, because you have King Henry VIII wanting a divorce and an annulment that he wasn't allowed to
Mhm.
have, and how, like, the
Mhm.
Protestants don't respect marriage the same way that we do. Can you just talk a little bit about that part of it?
Sure. So King Henry VIII. I'll try to tell this in relatively. There's a lot inherent about the book
Mhm,
in the book about this, but basically, King Henry VIII um, was married to Catherine of Aragon,
mhm,
uh, and at some point, King Henry VIII wanted to get an annulment. History remembers this as Henry wanted a divorce. He did, but prior to that,
Mhm.
he wanted an annulment. He wanted a declaration from the church that said, no, there's no marriage. And he used sort of this sort of pretzel logic for what his arguments were, which don't make any sense.
Mhm.
But when the church did not find nullity,
Mhm.
and in fact affirmed the validity of his marriage, then Henry then he wanted to get the divorce, but had to set up a new church to do it. And that's, setting up the Church of England is essentially, that's essentially the product of the fact that King Henry wanted a divorce. Um, so so from there, it's interesting to remember back to that time, because in the book I make an argument that at that time, most Catholics had probably never even heard the word nullity,
Mhm.
right? So if we think about what would happen in King Henry VIII, the Pope knew that if he did not find King Henry's marriage null, he would effectively lose England for the church. He would lose England. That's a pretty big deal. And yet, we could look back at the Pope not finding nullity as heroic. We could look at it that way. But I think a better way to look at it would be he didn't have a choice.
Mhm.
The marriage was valid. Now, despite the fact that King Henry was promiscuous, the biographers, when I researched this, I tried to find every biography of King Henry VIII I could find. They disagree about certain points, but all of them agree on this. He was incredibly promiscuous.
Mhm.
Um, he then, put to death, different, members of different orders. The Carthusians, most famously, put to death Bishop John Fisher, who was the great Bishop of England,
Yeah.
that again affirmed the marriage. And I make the point in the book that Bishop John Fisher died to protect matrimony.
Mhm.
That's why he died.
I liked that you brought that out,
St. Thomas,
that you had that saints died for the sacrament of marriage. I thought that was a really interesting way of framing their lives.
exactly, because it shows a great contrast, and not in a good way. It shows a huge contrast between where we are now and where we were then. Because now it's like, well, we want to get people back to the sacraments, and so let's try to see if we can possibly get this marriage annulled. That's not. I mean, so imagine this. Imagine. So we started off by speaking a little bit about how the bishops mandate divorce in the dioceses.
Mhm.
Can anybody imagine? Honestly, can anybody really imagine Bishop John Fisher telling Catherine of Aragon, look, Catherine, here's the thing. We're going to have a tribunal, but before you do that, I need you to go and get a divorce decree before we can even have this. I don't think anybody could really imagine that happening. And yet, it happens in every case in America now.
Mhm.
So, but back to your point, is that so basically what this became is that there began to be a segment of Christianity that thought divorce was fine. And in fact, Luther came along and backed it all up. And there were a lot of quotes by Luther in there that I think a lot of the readers will find shocking. But Luther he was extraordinarily anti-Catholic, but he was also extraordinarily anti-marriage.
Do you think part of the
Um,
problem in
uh,
America now is because we are like a Protestant rooted country?
yes, it's manifest. How do you like that for an answer? I think that's the case. I think the problem is that Protestantism essentially one of the problems with Protestantism's approach to marriage was and is, and it remains, is that Luther thought that marriage should be a product of the state and effectively only the state. Yeah, God was kind of involved, but largely this was a state product. Well, here's your problem. If it's a state product, it's a state's to uh, bring about. It's a state's to terminate. And once you do that, I mean, that's bad enough. It doesn't need, I don't want to get to the whole slippery slope thing because that's bad in its face. But it does open up something else. Well, if the state feels its proper role is to be involved in in marriage, why not the other sacraments?
Mhm.
And in fact, in 2020, the state was making that argument in large measure, right? I mean, during the time of COVID, you heard stories about people, taking down, there were officials taking down people's names and numbers for going to confession. I had a friend, some friends of mine had to wait like almost a year to have their baby baptized
Wow.
because people were sick. Well, we had people not getting, I mean, you want to talk about irony. How about this? We had people not get anointing of the sick because people were sick. So what I'm getting at is that we talked about the symbiotic. When you start really getting into what we've seen in the last few years,
Mhm.
the symbiotic nature of the sacraments gets pretty clear. And as I point out in the book, this isn't the first time. When we had the French revolutionary government, the French the revolutionaries sought out to rewrite catechisms.
Mhm.
They were good at what they were doing, and they were horrible, but they were good at what they were doing. And they realized, no, we'll just rewrite the catechism. So now baptism is simply it means incorporation of the state. It's got nothing to do with the Trinity.
Yeah.
So yeah, but essentially to answer your question, yes, I think that is in large measure what we're seeing here because it's a state product, and it's sadly the church is signing on to it with the divorce mandate.
Interesting. What advice would you have to restore like respect for the sanctity of marriage in America? Like, do you have any thoughts on how Catholics can help foster that and what we should do within the church?
So there's two, yeah. So we look at there's basically two aspects. There's the clergy and then the laity. So in terms of the clergy, I really believe that we need to hear from the pulpits that marriage is great, that marriage is wonderful. I'm not hearing that very often, and I'm trying to figure out why that's the case. Because, I'm a political speech writer, and whenever someone contacts me to write a speech, the very first question I ask, I'm not kidding, the first question I ask is, who's the audience?
Mhm.
The first one, before the topic, who's the audience? When priests give sermons, it's fairly clear who the audience is, right? It's the laity. They're not speaking to a bunch of other priests. There might be other priests in the audience, I suppose, but in large measure, the audience is a laity. What does that mean? It means it's people who are married or people who are products of marriage, for the generally speaking, right?
Mhm.
Why are they talking about marriage more? Why are we talking about matrimony? I'm not sure what it is, but I know that the priests have to speak. The priests have to be, for lack of a better word, cheerleaders for marriage.
Mhm.
Talk about why marriage is good. Talk about the heroism of marriage. Talk about the sacramentality of marriage. And I think even prior to all that, if people want to actually cut down on the number of divorces and annulments, but what about start doing this? Priests should start giving sermons on what to look for in a spouse. It's a great sermon, right?
Mhm.
In other words, and also too, it's who I should be. So if I have a sermon, if I'm a teenager, I'm just maybe starting to date or getting old enough to start dating. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I knew what sort of person I should be who's dateable and then marryable? Like talk about virtue, talk about the importance of holiness in a relationship. Um, I think that'd be great. So we need to have that's I think the clergy needs to be involved in really some very basic ways.
Mhm.
So that's the clergy. Um, from the perspective, there are other ideas too I have in my book, but I think that'd be a good start. From the perspective of the laity, I think those of us that have strong marriages should be ready to witness to people in trouble or other strong marriages or young couples. I think there should be some, we should try to have some involvement with younger couples to sort of guide them along the way. Some dioceses have that. There are some that are doing, I think, a very good job of that, of that aspect of all this. But I think so for the laity itself, for husbands and wives, as I said earlier, live sacramental lives, pray the rosary together.
Mhm.
Um, you know, support each other, help each other in the path to holiness. These are, basic things. And one last thing I would add that I think brings those two together is back in the day, maybe, I don't know, a few decades ago, blessing homes was standard.
Mhm.
When Lisa and I moved to Florida 3.5 years ago or so, that was one of the first things we wanted to get done is, okay, let's try to get a priest over to bless our home. It's basic. But priestly involvement with a lady, that's ideally what we want to have is both working together to support the sacraments.
So, do you have any last thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners before we wrap up for today?
So I'll leave you with one, and this is something that I think is very important. If there's sort of one takeaway is that especially it's no secret that we live in a pornographic world,
Mhm.
pornographic society, which is dangerous to marriage at all its stages, right? So I would say that we all need to develop a devotion to Mary. It's the antidote to so many ills of our society, right? So um, what does that mean? So that means start with praying the Rosary as a family. Um, you know, reading books about Mary, reading together. I'm a big fan of we homeschool,
Mhm.
and we're always talking about theology, or we're praying together. I think it's so important to do that, and I think that strengthens marriages. So remember that Mary loves marriage. How do we know? Well, why have evidence? We have evidence of that fact, right? So at Cana, when Mary says they have no wine, she realizes upon saying that if Jesus works a miracle, that begins his public ministry. In other words, that begins his road to Calvary. And yet, Mary says they have no wine. And so I think that's a very important lesson for us, that Mary loves marriage. And when I think back about the wedding feast of Cana, it's beautiful in so many ways. But when we look at the wedding feast of Cana, we don't even know the name of the couple that was married, right? But we know this. We know that Jesus was at the center of their marriage from the beginning. And I think that the similarity between the couple at Cana and married couples today, it's the same. Jesus is at the center of the beginning of our marriages. As my wife and I were married in the Eastern Catholic Church, and we put on crowns and we march around. That the priest leads us in a procession around the gospel to point out that the gospel is at the center of our lives from the beginning and should always be. But I think so. We need to live, prayerful lives. That I think is the key thing to this. So we need to really focus on a devotion to Mary, a devotion to prayer, and I think that is a powerful way of strengthening marriages.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love the story of the wedding feast at Cana, and that's so true that they had Christ at the center from the very beginning. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today and talking about your book and just the research you've done in this area. It's a really important area for people to be aware of the problems that are going on, and also just be aware that marriage is so beautiful and needs to be upheld and respected, and all of that in America right now.
Yes. So yeah. Thanks, Colin. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a good conversation. And to all of our listeners, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.